Does the fact that some things didn't always exist prove that God must exist? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Channel, Summary of the Summa Theologica. Today we're doing Part 1, Question 2, Article 3, Whether God Exists. This is actually the third video in a series. We're going through Aquinas' 5 ways to show that the statement God exists is true, and this is the third way. We can call this one the argument from possibility, although some people call it the argument from contingency. That's not really a vocab word that's used here, so we'll call it the argument from possibility. So it goes something like this. Premise 1, some things are generated or destroyed, or corrupted is really the word he says. So by generated, I mean brought into existence. By corrupted, I mean destroyed. So premise 2, these things must be possibles. By possibles, I mean it's possible for them to exist and possible for them not to exist. 3, that which is possible not to be at some time did not exist, right? That's what we said, is that they were generated and they will eventually be destroyed if they haven't been destroyed already. 4, so if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there would have been nothing in existence. In other words, if everything were like this, had to be generated, and so there's a moment in time where they didn't exist, Aquinas says, then there must have been a moment in time where all those things didn't exist. Now, this is the most contentious move in the argument, and we'll talk about it at the very end. So there would be an objection to this argument at the very end. So just hold off until then, and we'll discuss. Premise 5, that which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing. In other words, like if you don't exist already, something else has to bring you into existence. Now, this is something that Aquinas actually already argued for in ways 1 and 2. I'm going to take John Whipple's, John Whipple, by the way, wrote this book, The Metaphysical Thought of Thomas Aquinas, and I've relied on it heavily for these videos on the 5 ways. But I'll give you his summary of this, his Aquinas's argument for this premise in the first 2 ways. It goes something like this: if something begins to exist, it is brought into existence either by itself, by nothing, or by something else. Those are your 3 options. Number 2, can't be by itself. Why? Because in order for you to bring yourself into existence, you would have to already exist, right? In order to cause yourself to exist, you must already exist in order to cause something. So you must already exist, which is a contradiction. That doesn't make any sense. So that's off the table. It couldn't be by nothing, right? It's not the case that nothing brought you into existence, because he says that this would be contrary to, first of all, common sense, but second of all, the intelligibility of being. There would be just there'd be no reason for you to exist then, right? We would say that like there's nothing that explains your existence then. And so that's contrary to what we understand about being, which being is comprehensible, understandable, intelligible, right? So it can't be that. So therefore, it must be the case that if you didn't exist already, you were brought into existence by something else, and hence the premise here. So 6, so if at one time nothing was in existence, then nothing would have begun to exist, right? Because you would have had to have something else bring these things into existence. But if nothing's existing at that point, then there's nothing to bring those things into existence. 7, so nothing, if that's the case, then nothing would exist now, but 8, obviously, stuff exists now. 9, so something necessary must exist. In other words, it can't be the case then that everything is a possible. It must be the case that something must be a necessary, something that wasn't generated and is not going to be destroyed. And now you might think, this is the conclusion of his argument, right? He was just looking to show that there's a necessary being. That's God. That's what he wanted to show. QED. That's actually not the end of his argument, because he believes that there are necessary beings that are not God. He thinks that they're necessary beings that depend for their necessity on God. So in other words, like they are caused to be necessary. So it's a dependent necessity. So he'll go further and say, every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not. It's impossible to go on to an infinity in necessary things which have their necessity caused by another. And this has already been proven in the second way when he's talking about efficient causation. So if you're confused about that, go and watch that video again. So something must exist which has its own necessity, right? We can't go back to infinity in things that are getting their necessity caused. So there must be something that just has its own necessity, right? That is necessary in and of itself. And 13, this all men speak of as God. So there is his proof for the existence of God from the fact that some things are possible. Now, let's go back to premise 4 and look at that contentious premise. So the first thing that some people leveled at this premise is that it is a fallacy of composition. You know, to say that the individual objects in the universe are possibles doesn't mean that the universe as a whole is a possible thing, is a possible, I should say. In the same way as, if you're looking at, for example, a roof that's made of tiles and the tiles are all squares, that doesn't mean the roof is going to be a square. This roof could be a rectangle. So just because the universe is made up of possibles doesn't mean the universe itself must be a possible. Fallacy of composition. So the first response we could give is actually a response that came from before Aquinas' time from Avicenna, who would say that, okay, you're saying that the universe is a necessary object. All I was trying to show is that there must be some necessary object, right? And you've agreed with me that there must be some necessary object, and you're saying it's the universe. But let's talk about what this necessary object must be like. And then Avicenna goes into individual arguments to show that this thing must be God, right? It must be an intelligent agent, and it must be, eternal and all the other things. Of course, it's a necessary being; it's going to be eternal. But other things then that make it look like God and not the universe. A more serious objection here is that there's a quantifier shift. So rather than saying that if everything is a possible, so let's say that we're looking at the universe as just a collection of things, and they're all possibles. So if that's true, then the 4 shouldn't read that if everything is a possible, then at one time everything didn't exist. But at one time or another, each thing didn't exist. In other words, like what it should say is that if everything is a possible, then it didn't exist at some time, but that doesn't necessarily mean they all didn't exist at the same time, right? So there is a quantifier shift here, and this is definitely a more devastating argument. Because what you could have is just one possible after another, right? An infinite number of possibles in the past, and one just constantly giving rise to another. And you might think, whoa, an infinite regress of possibles, like that's not something that we should countenance. But for Aquinas, he believes that the universe could have been eternal in the past. So he does believe that this is a possibility. So he can't really object to it that way. At one time, I was actually impressed by the argument that given an infinite amount of time in the past, anything that possibly could happen, would happen. And so if it's possible that everything could cease exist at the same time, if that's a possibility, that everything just stopped existing, then that would happen given an infinite amount of time. So at one time I was impressed by that. I definitely don't think that's Aquinas' argument, and I'm not so sure that I'm convinced by that anymore. I'm not totally sure why. But what are we to do with this argument? Because obviously this objection, and it's not totally clear like what Aquinas thought about this, right? Like he leaves it really basic like this and doesn't really, seem to show that he's aware of any kind of quantifier shift. One thing we could say is possibly what he's intending by this argument was actually what he gave in Summa Contra Gentiles. So in Book 1, Chapter 3, which I have my entire collection. You can't really see that, can you? Can you see that? Yeah. It's a delicious collection. Where is it? I don't even know where I put it. Man, I have too many books. I don't even know where most of them are. But Summa Contra Gentiles, he gives an argument of talking about possibles in that book. And here's the way that the argument looks. It says this. Premise 1, some things are generated or corrupted. So this is the same premise 1. 2, so some things are possibles, right? Just like premise 2 of our argument we're looking at here. 3, possible things are equally open to existing and not existing, right? They just as easily could exist as to not exist. There's open possibilities there. 4, so possible things require a cause. There must be something that accounts for the fact that you exist when you could just as easily not exist. So this is a slightly different argument than the one that we were just looking at. 5, there cannot be an infinite regress of caused causes. So meaning that, like if you require something else to cause you to exist, and that thing requires something to cause it to exist, well, all those things, if we have an infinite amount of things like that, then there's nothing that's actually doing the real causing, right? All these things are waiting to be caused to exist in order to cause the next thing to exist. But none of them can actually work until there's something there that's the first cause that's actually causing the rest of them to exist. 6, so there must be a necessary being. A necessary being, not one that was made, can't be destroyed, something like that. And then 7, there can't be an infinite regress of caused necessary beings. So this is the rest of the argument that was not contentious that we talked about in just now in the Summa Theologica. 8, so there must be an uncaused first necessary being. And 9, this is God. The big difference between this argument, and this is one of the reasons why, is this really what he meant by the Summa Theologica argument? Because the Summa Theologica argument brings time into the picture, right? It says that, if there is a time at which nothing would exist. And this doesn't have that this doesn't have that as, I would say, a drawback, because this argument seems like it works, right? And it's because that you don't have to posit this weird time where everything doesn't exist at the same time. So it avoids the drawbacks of that first argument, but I don't know. It's not really clear if this is exactly what he meant in Summa Theologica. Another possibility, by the way, so this is one possible way that he could make it work. It would look way different, though. A second thing he may have meant and would have worked is an argument like this. Some things are generated or corrupted, right? So some things are possibles. These are matter-form composites. So this is going to rely heavily on the Aristotelian matter-form distinction. So if you haven't checked out my video on hylomorphism, definitely check out that video, and that'll explain a little bit better. But matter is the potential aspect of a thing. It's what's made to be the way that it is, and form is the actualizing aspect, makes the thing to be the way that it is. 4, matter and form are necessary beings. In other words, they're not things that are generated like the material objects in the world. But 5, their necessity is caused. So matter in itself is just pure potency. If it doesn't have form, like if it's just matter, that's pure potentiality. But pure potentiality isn't anything, right? You can't have pure potentiality just by itself. And pure form, a thing that is not making a thing to be a particular way, but just is pure form, that's just like an abstraction. So those two things in and of themselves need to be put together. And even when they're put together, they can't depend upon each other alone on pain of vicious circularity, right? Because they would just be upholding each other. So these things are necessary beings, but they are necessary beings that have their necessity caused. And then 6, there cannot be an infinite regress in caused necessary beings, as we already said. 7, So there must exist an uncaused necessary being. So this form of the argument I actually got from Edward Feser's Existential Inertia article. It's definitely possible that Aquinas meant this, because really, like, the 5 ways are generalizations of specific arguments, right? They're like, this is the type of argument that you could give, and then you could fill in the details in different ways. So it's possible that this was one of the ways that you could fill in the details. So this is definitely a way that you could do it. Feser actually includes the essence-existence distinction as well in this argument. I leave it out just because I think the essence-existence distinction is good in a different argument that Aquinas gives. So I prefer it there. So those are 2 ways this argument could possibly be saved. But in and of itself, it does seem like it commits the quantifier shift fallacy. And it's weird that Aquinas didn't catch the fact that there was a quantifier shift. So it might be the case that he actually meant one of these other 2 arguments when he was given this argument. So I don't know. But I'll leave that to you to figure out, and you let me know what you think. And I will see you guys in the 4th way next time in the next video. Adios.